So hey, welcome to the Chicago AWS user group. I'm Margaret, your fearless leader. Our logo is a deep dish pizza. Matt, I know you have strong feelings about pizza, but I made it so the cheese bubbles are clouds. um, we have still been virtual. I know we talked about when will we ever go back in person? Good question. I don't know the answer. Maybe in a month, maybe who knows. But thanks for joining during the day. We've found that during the day, virtual seems to do better than virtual at night. But in person, I think we'll do at night. We can always figure out what this world looks like when we get there. But we're also on socials. We have a Slack group, Twitter. We're using meetingplace.io and LinkedIn meeting place. But we still post on Meetup and Eventbrite and stuff like that. So you can find us in events there. We also have a beautiful website using Amplify. And then just not user group events coming up, but save the dates. We've got some stuff happening. Community Day Midwest, the meetup of meetups is June 16th. And because of this event, our CFP is pushed out for another week. So we need talk ideas. So hopefully this event will inspire some talk ideas. And then this is not official by any means, but the AWS Summit Chicago is going to be August 24th and 25th. I don't think Amazon's put it on their website yet, so save those dates. And then they usually do like a dev lounge community thing. They'll do like 30-minute tech talks from the user group community. As soon as I know details about that, I'll share it with the group. I want Chicago to, obviously be a force there. And then I also heard through the grapevine that reInvent tickets will start going on sale. I think, is it May 24th was the date? So if you're thinking about going to reInvent, save that date. And then I wanted to promote DevOps Days events and all days DevOps and this user group, always looking for good content. So if you're feeling inspired, you got lots of opportunities.
I will give you a little pro tip on the DevOps Days one. So actually, if you go to that same URL, but instead of events, do speaking, that will show you all the DevOps Days that, as far as the website understands, have an open CFP. So you can see those are the events that have that. So that's always kind of a extra thing. But someone's, that reminds me, we were doing back way before virtual was a thing. A company I was working for, we were being acquired by a company in New York. And so we had a lot of really early morning calls because they were for New York, and someone had, their dog was barking because we would call in from home because it was early. And the New York guy was, "Hey, someone's got to let that dog out." And that's what I always think of when I hear dogs barking on conference calls.
Is that your dog barking?
It's not my dog.
Oh.
No, I don't. My dog's sleeping.
Oh, sorry. Let me do better meeting hygiene. Let me mute everybody except Matt. Unmute. There we go. Did that work? I guess I cannot unmute you, Matt. You can mute yourself.
Ta-da.
Okay, cool. I will stop sharing. So Maddie is our wonderful presenter today, and we're recording this because I wanted to have a copy of this, but feel free to jump in with questions, and then I plan to stop recording towards the end. So if you have an idea and you do want to workshop it, you don't have to fear being recorded for a bad idea or something like that. So we won't take the full hour of being talked at. Maddie's gonna answer questions. Please jump in. This is not a webinar or a lecture. So jump in with questions, but we will also preserve some time at the end to discuss as a group. So feel free to speak or type whenever you're comfortable.
Right. I was going to say, during the presentation, just to make it a little, you can either jump in or just type on the chat. If you want to type on the chat, I'll just repeat the question. That way it'll get on the recording, like Margaret said. So for folks who didn't attend, but that'll only be the beginning, and then we'll kind of move off from there. So, excuse me. I'm kind of excited to do this webinar because back in 2020, did I just call it a webinar? To do this presentation, to do this thing. Well, so back in 2020, when we thought we were going to do a DevOps Days Chicago in person, we actually had scheduled a joint meetup between and it was going to be virtual because it was when COVID had started. But when we all thought, we thought what we thought, there was a joint meetup between this group and the DevOps Days, not DevOps Days, the Chicago DevOps meetup that was going to be to, talk about how to, come up with talk ideas so to get people to submit talks for DevOps Day Chicago. Fortunately, our CFP for DevOps Day Chicago is closed, but DevOps Day Chicago is happening in September, but maybe for next year. We'll talk about that another time. But so I used to call this talk how to train yourself dragon style to submit talks, but that was too much. And I changed it to don't fear the CFP. If you're not familiar, so CFP can mean call for papers or call for proposals. And really it's when a conference is asking for people to submit ideas or talks they want to give at that conference. So that's our first lesson, is what does CFP stand for? So just a quick bit, no one really cares who I am, but just some of this will play into why I'm talking about this a little bit. So I am the global chair for DevOps Days around the world. I've been doing that for a couple of years. I've been on the core team for a few years. I go to a lot of DevOps Days and sometimes even speak at a lot of DevOps Days. Along with Margaret, I'm one of the organizers of DevOps Days Chicago. I'm one of the original organizers, and I pretty much in almost the entire time that it's existed have run the program committee, or at least been a key part of it. So I've spent a fair amount of time evaluating proposals and selecting them. I have a podcast about DevOps that has nothing to do with giving talks, but whatever, it's a thing. Again, I've spent a fair amount of time speaking at events.
Oh no, I see other people moving, but not Matt.
Infrastructure as code, and also just because I used to have the license plate DevOps, but because I moved, I had to get a new license plate, so now it's kubectl. So that's a whole other story. But
hey, Maddie, real quick.
Yes.
I think you froze for a second, right when you were talking about like what you do during the day. If you want to.
I don't think I really talked about what I do during the day.
Okay. Well,
you mean when I hit the Pulumi slide or Pulumi image? Oh, I just said I work at Pulumi.
Okay. Cool.
But I'm a developer advocate, which means I talk at conferences a lot. So that's sort of the connection of that. That to me was the least interesting part of this whole slide, was that I work at Pulumi, so it was fine. I also really like Diet Coke, which is why I have a Pulumi puss with the Diet Coke. But okay, let's kind of dig into when we're doing this. The other thing I want to say as well, in addition to doing the program chair, I'm also one of the program chairs for All Day DevOps. I've been a program chair for the Cloud Engineering Summit. So I see a whole lot of talk proposals is the gist. So here's the thing. So like submitting a talk to speak at a conference, beyond just giving the talk, submitting the talk can be really intimidating. There's an anecdotal stat that a certain number of that if you look at people's fears, public speaking ranks higher than death, which means that if you have to be at a funeral, you'd rather be the guest of honor than the person doing the eulogy. I don't know the real stat on that, but so public speaking can be intimidating and scary, but even just submitting one. And the thing is, where this comes up is we spent a lot of time listening to podcasts, watching talks, following big thinkers on Twitter. And so we start to think that the only messaging anyone ever wants to hear are these like radical, innovative, super insightful ideas. That's not to say that your ideas are not super innovative and interesting, because they are. But the truth is, no matter what your level of experience, you have a unique story. No one has the story that you do, and that story has value. You don't have to share like some completely novel approach to container management for someone to want to listen to you. They'd probably be thrilled just to hear the history of what you did to run Kubernetes in production. Well, most people really want to hear that. And even if you think everyone knows this, your particular spin on the story is special, and it's therefore valuable. So nobody knows exactly what you know in the way that you know it. And I want to say that again, because it's probably the most important thing about all of this. Nobody knows exactly what you know in the way that you know it. When I look at talks that we've had at conferences, the ones that are the most interesting and the most well received and people love are stories. And I'll put it to you this way. The first DevOps days took place 12 years ago. If my math is right, I don't know, 11, whatever. It was in 2009 in Ghent in Belgium. And I look at the 6 or 7 talks that were there. Those talks could all be given at a DevOps days today. And that doesn't mean we haven't learned anything in the last 11 plus years. It just means that those stories are still interesting. So cool. So here's a couple things though. And this is very practical as in its approach is what I'm trying to do today is one thing. And this is some of these are like myth busting. A lot of times people think they have to write the talk in order to submit it. Oh my goodness, no, please don't do this because there's a couple of reasons why I don't do this. It could be a waste of your time because maybe the idea just doesn't pan out and you spend a lot of time. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't develop things if that helps you write your abstract. But here's the thing. An abstract is enough. And an abstract is just the 2 or 3 paragraph description, the overview of your talk. It doesn't even need an outline. Just come up with an idea, right? Just one or, like I said, a few paragraphs is all you need. More than 3 is too much for an abstract. And you don't even need to know that your idea would even pan out, right? So don't invest the time in writing out the whole talk until you know it gets accepted. And there's a couple reasons for that. One is just in general, don't exert the effort that you don't need to, but also maybe your idea that someone would be interested in like is just not right and you would have to adjust. So, and you don't even need to know if the idea will work. So for example, when I came up with this talk I have called the 5 love languages of DevOps, I simply had this theory that the metaphor of love languages from that kind of terrible self-help book would apply to DevOps. And that's as far as I got before I submitted the abstract. So if your original, and then I wasn't even sure till I started writing it, like how it was going to work. So the thing is, if your original hypothesis doesn't pan out exactly as you hoped, you can tweak it while you're writing the talk. It's probably fine. Now, again, it could be totally off base, which could be, I have this hypothesis that people who use Kubernetes are all living in Hawaii. I don't know why that talk would ever get accepted, but also you are probably going to be not going to resolve something out of that. I had a talk called The Psychology of Chaos Engineering, and I had assumptions about, or I had hypotheses about data that I would collect of people doing chaos engineering, and my data didn't really pan out, but I was still able to create the talk that met to the spirit and what I had written in the abstract. Anyway, you don't have to write out the whole talk. All you need is an idea. And ideas are cheap. They're not easy, but they're cheap. Cool. So where do we, also think about this. You can use a talk to learn something. I think learning through giving a talk is really super duper powerful. It's a really great way to learn a thing. If, for example, I maybe this is kind of a dated example because I'm going to talk about Chef, like when I used to work there. But maybe I would say, okay, I have a theory about how to build a pipeline to use inspect compliance to test my cookbooks. I just have this theory. I don't have to know exactly how to do it to write the abstract. I can come up with the idea and I learn how to do it as I write the talk. And the reason that this is really powerful is I believe really strongly in what I sort of think about is the learn, do, teach modality, right? Or pattern. Because when we're teaching somebody something, we exercise different neural pathways than we did to learn the thing, and it cements our learning. So not only is it a great way just to have an excuse to, writing the talk, creating the talk as a reason to learn a thing, you'll learn it in a different way when you have to teach it. And again, just as that reminder, your idea doesn't have to be proven out at this point. So like, how do we come up with an idea, right? I said ideas were cheap, but they're not easy. And, I especially people who work in developer relations or something like me, we have, OKRs around writing a certain number of abstracts a quarter. We have to create this content. And it's tough when you sit there and it's like, okay, ready now, have an idea, be creative, right? Doesn't happen. Most great ideas will happen while you're, cutting the grass, taking a shower, doing the dishes, anything that disconnects your brain. We're not going to talk about how to do that in here. We can talk later about best ways to cut your grass if you'd like. It's getting to be that season. But what are some of the things? So one is going back to your own stories, your own experience. So even if a lot of other people have spoken about a topic, your experience is different than anyone else's. Your story is special. And real world stories are much more valuable than theory. There's a reason. So DevOps Enterprise Summit, they pretty much only accept what they call experience reports, right? So they want to talk that's not about this theory or this idea. It's here's how we did this thing at my company, right? One of my favorite talks, this is just that we had at DevOps Day Chicago more than a few years ago, was someone was giving a talk of basically how they messed up their DevOps implementation. And it was really kind of fun because they had a really hard time getting it past their company's PR, because their company's PR was like, wait, you can't go and give a talk about how we did something bad. And she's like, it's not bad. We learned, right? But like those stories are so valuable, especially, I will tell you something, failure stories. Oh, if you can do it, because nobody wants to talk about when everything wasn't beautiful, right? So if you can tell a story about when you tried something and didn't succeed, but what you learned from it, you can give that talk 15 times a year if you want to. That's so powerful. Something that you've learned recently that you found super interesting. I just like this image. It doesn't really map to what I'm trying to say, but I thought that was a really funny image I found. So maybe you just learned a cool new way to test, your Go code. So if you present a talk about this thing you just learned how to do, it has two really great outcomes. So one of them is you're going to be really excited to talk about it, which will make you a really engaging speaker because you're really excited because you just learned it. And we get excited about stuff we just learned. And back to what I said before, it's going to really cement that knowledge in your brain from that learn, do, teach model. So that's awesome. Something that you want to learn about. Maybe you didn't learn it yet, but you're like, you know what? I've been hearing some cool stuff about this Pulumi thing. I want to learn Pulumi. I'm going to submit a talk about how I'm going to learn Pulumi. And it gives you a reason to learn that thing because you have to write a talk about it. The people, I don't know if folks who will like sign up for the marathon as a forcing function to make them train for a marathon. This is sort of like that too. Can be a little scary to do it. It depends on your personality type, but sometimes it works pretty well, right? All right. So those are some of the general ideas. And we're going to talk later in the non-recorded part about some specific ideas you might have. But I want to kind of go through and talk about where do you submit these talks. And some of this might feel a little different in this, however many years into the pandemic we're in, because you have virtual and you have in person, but the ideas still apply for the most part. But a couple things to think about. I had to change this slide. This used to say, forget about places like Velocity. It's very easy to forget about Velocity now because there no longer is a Velocity. So I said KubeCon instead. What do I mean by this? Is these really large marquee events. That usual echo chamber, so to speak, says the guy speaking at KubeCon next week. It can be pretty intimidating. And I'm not throwing shade at these large events, but if you're talking about going to a big stage, you're competing against, quote, the big names. And this is your first time around. You're setting yourself up for a big challenge. You may be into a big challenge. I am not the one to tell you don't do it, right? So that being said, don't avoid submitting to those conferences because a lot of these conferences really do like first-time speakers. But I wouldn't pin all your hopes on the big ones either. They're not, don't just say, okay, well, I submitted to KubeCon, now what? Where that comes in, or, whatever various different AWS giant events and such. Another great one is places that aren't familiar with your particular expertise or focus. I've done this a lot and kind of, because here's the thing, if you go to the conference that's like all the attendees, like let's say you're the super duper expert in secrets management, on cloud providers, and you go to like Secret Management Con, oh my goodness, you've got like super expert level audience and you're competing with all the experts. If you go to a general developer conference, like they'll be like, cool, I didn't even know that was a thing I should worry about. So you don't have to be as deep an expert to be able to do it. And you're going to have probably a little bit more of an interested audience. So for example, I always say, my subject area is DevOps, which is super duper broad, I know, but I like to consider conferences and groups that aren't as familiar with it and would find it interesting. Especially, I talk a lot about the cultural part of DevOps. So, for example, places I like to consider when I'm building these is local, software engineering meetups that aren't necessarily talking about as much of this. Also, some of this content and these slides, like I wrote a few years ago, so what people are aware of might have changed in the last 4 or 5 years. Agile conferences are amazing to go talk about DevOps at because they don't know anything about this stuff, but they're really interested. Or software testing. So it'll be different for who you are, but it's a really great way to also lower the stakes a little bit. So if you're familiar with DevOps days, I know we didn't invent the Ignite format, but almost every DevOps days will have a set of Ignites. They're different than lightning talks. Lightning talks are great too, but Ignites specifically at DevOps days can be a really great place to try out short talks, but they do have some challenges. So one is they have a really specific format. So it's a 5-minute, wow, how many times? Each slide advances for 15 seconds for over 5. So it's 20 slides, auto advancing every 15 seconds. You have no control over them. So it can be tough, but it also can be super fun. And now this thing, I put a bullet point that said DevOps days can be picky about repeated content. Come and ask me how often I'm giving the same talk at various DevOps days this year. This has changed a little bit. But the good thing is most DevOps days are usually short on submissions for Ignites because everybody wants to give the big talk. So you actually might stand a better chance of getting accepted if you're talking about a lightning talk or an Ignite, specifically Ignites at DevOps days. They're almost always looking for them because they just don't get as many submissions. Doesn't mean that you can submit something that's crap and you'll get in, but the competition's a little different. There's just not as many. So I also like to say you don't have to pread it. And this is a reference to my friend, Paul Reed. And the reason I give this example is it's been a while, but when Paul was on the speaking circuit, he might give 10 talks a year, and he would write a brand new talk for every conference that he spoke at. That is exhausting. And maybe Paul could do it, but you're not Paul. And I don't mean you're not as good as Paul. I mean, you're smarter than Paul, and you wouldn't bring that upon yourself. So now the secret of how he does it is, even though all of his talks were different, they tended to be variations on a theme. But if we're just getting started, don't make things any harder on yourself than you need to. So don't feel like you have to kind of create all these brand new talks constantly. But we're going to talk about that a little bit in a second when we go to the next bit. And I like to say this is don't overkill. And this is where, like, if we had audio, I'd have Colin Hay from Men at Work going, I can't do sleep, play an overkill. But here's what you do. This is the pro tip. This is how everybody that you're like, that is a speaker I want to be, just humble, other people, whatever. You come up with 1 or 2 abstracts and you submit them everywhere. Now, they should be different from each other in a meaningful way. And as you get accepted, you give these talks, every time you're going to get better at them. And throughout the time, you just keep polishing. Now, you will probably tweak this abstract depending upon the conference. You'll look at what the conference is looking for, and there might be different things to focus on. But this is me. I have throughout the year, I will have about 6 talks that I propose. And I don't propose all 6 at the same time because they kind of rotate through as I'm testing them out. But I do keep doing a lot of the same abstracts because once they start to hit, it means that they're becoming well received. But when you watch that, it's not the same talk over and over and over again. When you watch them, they continue to evolve. So having to create new content for every conference can be exhausting, and it doesn't really provide as much value as everyone thinks it does, because people are like, oh, well, you give the same talk at all these conferences, people get tired of it. Most people don't go to 15 DevOps days a year, only crazy people like me, right? Also, yes, a lot more talks, and especially in virtual and hybrid, are available online, but not everybody's going to go and sit and watch those. And the experience of seeing it will change over time. I have a talk that I gave, I don't know, I've given 20 plus times. My friend Aaron has seen it almost every time, and he gets something out of it every time because it changes and he changes and he's different. So I always like, this is the one that might feel a little different. Maybe it's not physically the same, but I like to say, try out your new material on the road. So when you've got something new that you're wanting to experiment with, you can volunteer to give the talk at a meetup like this one first before you're trying to give it at a larger event. That doesn't necessarily even mean before you propose it, even after it's accepted. I love to try out talks at meetups, and it's not because meetups don't have as high of a bar for content quality. It's not saying I'm giving you bad content, but you get it's a lot easier to get direct feedback, because especially if it's an in-person meetup. Margaret can tell you, most meetups, we're always looking for people to volunteer to present content. So most meetup organizers will be delighted to work with you. So it's also, now this is a little bit more of an advanced way to approach it. If you can, I think it can be really helpful and a lot less intimidating, depending on your personality, to present at an out-of-town meetup where you're not necessarily part of that group or community. Because then maybe sometimes we get nervous, like this group here, like this is your community, this is your hometown. It can be, it's sort of like, the bands when they play their hometown show and now they've got to like do extra good because all the people they went to high school with are going to watch it, right? But you don't, if you're going and presenting at the Denver AWS user group or something, you don't have to worry as much about your reputation or your perceived lack thereof preceding you, right? That again, your mileage may vary. Everyone's a little different, but I think that's kind of a fun thing. Big believer in collaborative development, if you will. So peer reviews are a great tool. And I don't necessarily mean getting a review of your final deck, although that's not a bad idea either, but rather getting input into your abstract, your themes, your talk structure. So I always workshop my abstracts in a Google Doc, and then I share those with comments aloud. And then that way I get a lot of feedback. And there's a lot of things I don't think about that come up because the whole is greater than some of its parts. So who could do this for you? I mean, your coworkers, if you have friends in the community, event organizers where you are speaking. I'll tell you, as an event organizer for DevOps Day Chicago, if you came to me and said, hey, and you don't know me from anybody, but I'm working on this proposal, could I run it past you and get your comments? I would be delighted to do that. It would be amazing. Nobody ever asks for this, and everybody can use it, myself included. You could always ask, on social media if you're feeling especially bold, on that feedback you might get. And the other thing too is when we're thinking about how we kind of do this one's a little tricky. So sort of take it the way that I will, because you might be concerned you don't have enough content for a full talk. And so Q&A can really help here. It makes the talk more interactive and it can help stretch out the time. That said, depending upon how you present, and I don't mean keynote versus PowerPoint, but how you look, as in, do you look like me or do you look like an under-indexed person? Your Q&A can actually be hostile and toxic, and it's completely okay to not want to do it. But if you do, and you're in a place where you feel safe to do that, and I definitely don't do Q&A and say, are there any questions? Or even the more prepared, even the more polished, what questions can I answer for you? An open-ended statement like that can result in crickets. You can start with that, but if there aren't any, be ready for some kind of call to action question. So like if your talk is about postmortems, you can ask the audience if anyone has a good process for them in their organization and share that. So Q&A doesn't have to be Q's and A's if you set it up for that, right? So there is that whole, hey, this is more of a comment than a question. Sometimes more of a comment than a question is okay as long as that's what you want to do, right? You're setting up for that. We're going to do that at the end of this talk, right? It's not just going to be about questions. I want to hear stories too. So one last little bonus tip. One thing is I really highly recommend keeping a page with all of your talks with links to your slides. There's a couple different great tools for doing this. Noticed which is noti.st or whatever, because of course it is. That's what I use for my speaking page. And that's sort of, you can see that a little bit in the top one. So I always upload my slides. That you can always use something like Speaker Deck or SlideShare. Noticed I like for different reasons. Polywork is great for this too. I actually use a combination of Polywork and Noticed. And to be honest, my Noticed is mostly the most updated because that's where I store my slides. And I always tell people at the end of the talk, go to speaking.mattstratton.com to see the slides, exception being this talk, because I didn't actually put those there, but I will give you a link to where you can get these slides, you know, or also your own jam. You want to like roll your own thing in 11D or Hugo or Gatsby or whatnot and write a serverless function to do all this. Hey, man, you know, do that, write a talk about it even. That'd be great. So a couple wind up things. So this bit.ly link, so bit.ly/talk-advice will take you to this deck. Speaking.mattstratton.com is my speaker page that has a list of all of my existing talks and upcoming talks and how that works. So if you want to see what a slicked up notice page could look like, and then maddie.wtf will take you to my Polywork. And that kind of brings us to the end of what I have from a presentation perspective. So Margaret, I don't know if you want to
Yep.
stop the
We're stopping
recording.
recording.
And then we'll, yeah.